Hey guys, it's me, Seren, back with another video. This is our last review of Watchmen before the final episode. This is a review of episode 8. It will be done in the good, the bad, and the ugly format. However, I felt like with episode 8, the writers were really back to form, and I have very few complaints about this episode. It's mostly going to be good. I don't even know. We're just going to get to the end and see if there's any bad or ugly. I really enjoyed this episode. This is probably my second favorite episode overall. I feel like the Angela-centric episodes are really the strong point of this show, of this season, and of this series thus far. One thing I will say about the writing of Watchmen is that I feel like the writing of Angela and her storylines and her plot lines have been very tight, very cohesive, extremely interesting. I kind of get the feeling that they wrote Angela's whole story and the way that things directly affected her and the way that those things sort of tied back into the Watchmen canon, and then everything else they were kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna have to like make up like other subplots and like have other stuff going on in the show and like link other things back to the canon. And in some of those other places I feel like is where the writing has fallen flat, but on these Angela sort of centric episodes, like they really remain on point. In episode 8, we got an explanation of Dr. Manhattan and Angela, aka Cal and Angela, which starts in Vietnam when 10 years before, so it's 2009, it's 10 years before the sort of present day events that we're seeing, and yet this whole episode sort of takes place in the mind of Dr. Manhattan, and it really revolves around the way that he experiences time. Dr. Manhattan experiences time in a very much non-linear format. The idea is that as a sort of supreme being, he's living in a quantum universe, and so he does not experience time the way that we do in a linear fashion. It's sort of like he experiences all time at once. His experience and the way that they decided to portray it in this show really reminded me of the movie Arrival. I don't know how many of you guys have seen that movie. It was on Netflix for a while. I don't know if it's still on there, but it has Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner and Forest Whitaker. Really interesting movie with amazing, wonderful cinematography by Brad Jordan, who is a Black cinematographer. And part of Arrival, well, not part of it, the whole thing of Arrival revolves around these aliens that come, and it turns out they experience time it's like a circle. It's like very circular. You sort of experience time all at once. Everything is happening all at once instead of linear, and that's sort of the way that this episode plays out. We get the backstory of Dr. Manhattan through his experience of time. There's a lot of time jumping in this episode, but I'm going to try and talk about his life and experiences and what we see semi-chronologically. So even though the episode starts when he sort of appears to Angela, who's sitting in a bar in Vietnam in 2009, memorializing her parents' death. That's why she's there. And he appears to her and he asks her to go on a date with him, to have dinner with him. And she's like, who the fuck are you? Like, no, I don't want to go on a date with you. And he basically tells her, like, you're going to agree. We're going to go on this date. We're going to get married. All these things are going to happen. I already know because I'm the real Dr. Manhattan. And then things sort of like unfold from there. So John Osterman is born in 1929 to German-American parents. In 1936, they flee their home and take up residence as refugees in a manor. Osterman inadvertently witnesses the owners of the manor having sex, which he recalls as the first moment he feels he witnessed love. The couple sit him down later to talk about what he saw when he saw them, and they give him a Bible explaining the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and how God made the world and how they're trying to make a son. These people seem pretty fucking creepy to me. They pressed him to agree to make something beautiful, but clearly they had an impact on him because later, as Dr. Manhattan, he ends up creating them, and these are the two people that we have seen playing as the servants to Ozymandias. And he also, Dr. Manhattan, he also creates the Garden of Eve, complete with the original manor where he lived with this couple. He creates all of this on a moon of Jupiter called Europa. And obviously, this is where Ozymandias has been trying to escape from. The clones that he's been growing and using as servants are biological life forms modeled after the couple from John's childhood. I don't know if they're explicitly named on the show. You guys can tell me if they are, but I watched the show with the captions on, and in the captions, they are named Crookshanks and Phillips. I believe, but you guys can let me know if that's like correct or incorrect. I literally only just noticed that they had names this past episode. This episode is where they really establish that Dr. Manhattan is truly like a god, like a supreme being capable of creating life. We see him creating this Garden of Eden on this moon of Jupiter. We see him creating the manor. We see him creating this couple, this man and this woman, who are supposed to be the Adam and Eve characters that they like impressed upon him as a child. There's a very clear juxtaposition against, our Judeo-Christian idea of God in the Garden of Eden, just the existential themes overall, establishing Dr. Manhattan as this like all-powerful, omnipotent figure, which is really encompassing for me this episode, as well as his moving away from humanity, which is a major theme of Dr. Manhattan's character in the original Watchmen, that he sort of is evolving past his original humanity, and yet one of his consistent downfalls and his Achilles heels is his ability to still feel. He still feels things, he still has feelings, he can still feel love. He fell in love with the second Silk Spectre. In this current sort of retcon, we find out that he fell in love with Angela Abar. He's still able to feel these feelings, and that leads to him to still make certain types of decisions, and that play out and that end up affecting, all these different types of people that are involved, which I thought was just like a really, really interesting way of exploring these ideas around this sort of omnipotent, all-powerful being. I also thought that Yahya, the actor playing him, Black Manta, he had this like really amazing charm about him, like this like clinical way of sort of looking at things and experiencing of time all at once is very much charming in its own way. It's very much, to me, it reminded me of the current iteration of Mr. Spock in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies, this sort of frustrating but also somewhat charming figure that can tell you, the good and the bad. And you can really see explicitly why this ability would appeal to Angela, because as he says to her in this episode several times, above all else, Angela wants stability, she wants security, she wants the ability to know what's coming next after the unexpected deaths of her parents and her grandmother, and she meets somebody that is able to give her that knowledge without a shadow of a doubt, which is reassuring and very stabilizing and grounding for her, making her feel comfortable enough to embrace having a family, which is what she wants above all things, but which is what she's also most terrified of having because of her past experiences, and she's terrified of having it taken away from her. So when he meets her, she repeatedly says she doesn't want kids and she doesn't want a family, even though we've already seen in earlier episodes how familial and loving she really is with her family members. Again, just really getting back to smart, just really intelligent, crafty writing and the ability to have things happening now that give the family scenes and that give earlier episodes, an extra punch. Because I know I've mentioned in some of my earlier reviews, like, it's really great seeing the way that she interacts with her family and just how warm and loving and caring she is, and to know that like that came from her feeling safe with Dr. Manhattan is a very interesting development for me. It really was. And I did not have faith, because y'all know I do not like romantic subplots, but it worked for me. So the episode moves back and forth through time from their first date to these other events. We experience time the same way as Dr. Manhattan, which is knowing how it's going to end, but seeing her sort of give these protests, because we're already 8 episodes in, we've already seen that they do end up getting married and that all these things end up happening. So it's sort of like we are in the same place of Dr. Manhattan of like, yes, we know, like you're not, we know. Angela has a million reasons why she would never date him, and yet we know that she does. So it's sort of just like waiting to see, like, how are we going to get from point A to point B, right? We know where point A is, we know where point B is, but how are we going to get, what is the in-between, what is the tunnel, which ends up being another major theme of this episode, how are we going to get there? Angela has a million reasons why she would never date him. She tells him that she hates Dr. Manhattan because her parents were killed by a Vietnamese terrorist after Dr. Manhattan basically subjugated Vietnam. He became, 100 feet tall and motherfucking squashed the Viet Cong like bugs. And he actually tells Angela that he regrets Vietnam. And then she says to him, Angela's very much like challenging with him, which you can tell he really enjoys. She's like, well, if you regretted it, if you are really Dr. Manhattan and you experienced time all at once, you knew you were going to regret it, and you did it anyway. And he said to her, haven't you ever done something that you knew you were going to regret, but you did it anyway because you felt like it was the right thing to do, right? These conversations that they have about knowing something bad is going to happen and doing it anyway, and like they really introduce the idea of time loops in this episode, and sort of like this time as being like a track, right? Time as being something circular where you can see what's coming, but it's almost like you can't get off. And even though you know what's going to happen, you're still going to do it. You can't stop it from happening because you know it's already happened. You know it's going to continue to happen. You know it's going to happen again. That part of it reminded me. I had so many references while watching this. That part of it reminded me of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry realizes that he's the one that did the Patronus, so he knows he can do it. I knew I could do it because I already did it. It's just this idea of time as something being on a track. And so once you have the knowledge of what's going to happen, it's still going to happen because it's a loop. It's coming, maybe I'm not explaining it well, but I don't know. I like time travel, and I like that they introduced this idea of time loops. This concept of everything that's going to happen, everything that happened already happened, so it's going to happen. It's like you don't really have a choice, right? Again, like I knew I could make the Patronus because I've already done it. Or again, the time traveler's wife, where it's almost like being pulled through time against your will because you know something is going to happen. You're just trying to figure out when exactly. It also reminded me of the alien from Men in Black 3. Can't think of his name, but he has the hat. Where he's experiencing all these times and universes and options, all at once, but any one of them can happen. Dr. Manhattan also really reminded me of Mr. Nobody from Doom Patrol, who is a great, wonderful character with this omnipresence, these like all-encompassing powers after he was ripped apart in a machine and put himself back together. Like, I don't know, like there was just so many references that I thought of while watching these scenes, which isn't a bad thing. Like, I'm not trying to say that the scenes were derivative. I didn't feel like they were derivative. They were very original, but it's just very fascinating to me, the use of time and time travel and time loops and the like to explore existential philosophical ideas about choice and free will in life, which is really what we're sort of getting to, right? Like, if you know something's going to happen and it's unavoidable, what does that mean in the sense of free will, right? Like, Dr. Manhattan could have probably like snapped his fingers and like made Angela like do those things, but it was almost like, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to convince you because I already know that I'm going to sit here and convince you. And I already know you're going to agree to have dinner with me tomorrow. And I already know we're going to get married and all these things are going to happen. I already know. The only thing that he doesn't know was that, we're going to be together, and then there's going to be, a darkness, a blank space of time where I can't see. And then I can see what's going to happen at the end, and you're still going to be there. So even though it's dark for me, I can't see what's happening in between, I'm going to take this risk and do this with you. And then he also tells her we're going to have 10 years together, and then it's going to end tragically because I can see the tragedy at the end. And she says, oh, it's like a tunnel. Normally we talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, but instead they're going to be in a tunnel of love in the darkness, have this time together, and then it's going to end. It's like I could try and like actively take steps to avoid doing it, but the way that I'm experiencing time, it's like it's already happened, so I might as well just go with it. It's time travel gets confusing to talk about, but I really appreciated these themes in this episode. On their very first meeting at this bar in Vietnam in 2009, Dr. Manhattan tells Angela about a big fight that they're going to have in 6 months, where she's going to tell him to leave. And even though she doesn't believe him at first, and then actively tries to avoid getting into the fight, we see them sort of catch up to it in real time, and it still occurs. And the fight is over her issues with family and vulnerability, and Angela's like, don't tell me what I'm gonna fucking say. Like, it's very frustrating to her. He knows what's gonna happen. He knows what she's gonna say. He knows how things are gonna go, and he does these things anyway because he has to, because he knows it's going to happen. Like, they're already sort of stuck in this time loop, and the weight of his powers and the weight of his abilities is really weighing heavily on Angela. So he makes the decision to go to Ozymandias and say, you know, how are you gonna destroy me? Because in a sense, I need to be destroyed so that I can be with this person that I love. It's very classic, you know, super being falls in love with a mortal. And there was some really great dialogue in the scene where Dr. Manhattan goes to see Ozymandias. You know, Ozymandias is very upset. He's very disillusioned with humanity because he feels like I went through all of this trouble to sort of, you know, create this squid attack to create this utopia, and yet humans are still finding a way to fight one another. He has this dialogue where he's like, why do they keep making their bombs? And Dr. Manhattan is like, this may seem paradoxical, but the bombs make them feel safe. Perfect. Perfect line, perfect writing, perfect exchange. It was perfect Watchmen. I was like, ooh, you writers. Ooh, you back. But yeah, Dr. Manhattan wants to be mortal again. He wants to be with Angela. He knows that they are going to be together, but he can't be with her this way because she's suffering under the weight of his abilities, which we see with this argument that they had. So he wants to be not omnipresent anymore. He goes to see Adrian to lose his memory of being Dr. Manhattan, and Ozymandias reveals that he created a device to destroy him. It's made with space particles that are called tachyons, which block Dr. Manhattan's powers and his memory. It's like a little small device that can be inserted into his head that will completely just like block everything and make him forget who he is, except in emergency situations where they can act as a reflex, which it turns out that, of course, this is what happened when 7K came to the house and attacked Angela and shot her. As you guys know, way back, however many reviews ago, I said, I was like, what happened to the other gunmen? Like, how did they get out of that? And of course, it's revealed that since Cal is Dr. Manhattan, he zapped the other gunmen away. So he did not kill the other gunmen, I don't believe. And so since he zapped him away, I feel like that's probably how 7K came to the realization that Dr. Manhattan was not on Mars, but that he was on Earth, pretending to be a human, because it's like, who else would have the power to zap somebody away? So that kind of like very neatly explains how they knew who he was without being unrealistic for me. I thought that was written really, really well. I know that sort of playing around with quantum physics and different materials is also a big part of the original Watchmen canon. And so I like that they haven't shied away from that with their use of these metals and these materials, like the stuff that Mirror Dude's like mask is made out of, that's meant to sort of block against psychic attacks, and this like tachyon that's sort of a debilitating material for Dr. Manhattan. You know, again, just sort of these reminders that like, even though this looks like our world, our universe, it is absolutely not our world. It is absolutely not our universe. I also like that they continue to throw in these Superman references. The whole tachyon thing was very kryptonite. I feel like that was the second or third Superman reference in the show. We had a sort of very direct Superman reference in Angela's episode where we saw her childhood in Vietnam and her parents, with the introduction of Lady True when she goes to buy the farm from the couple just before the meteor lands in their backyard or whatever. There are a lot of Superman references in this show that I really, really, really appreciate. Dr. Manhattan also reveals to Ozymandias when he goes to see him about, you know, help me forget who I am so that I can be with this woman. Dr. Manhattan reveals to Ozymandias that he basically created a utopia, the utopia that Ozymandias wants on Earth. Dr. Manhattan already created on this moon of Jupiter along with Adam and Eve, but that he doesn't want to be there anymore. So since Ozymandias is upset that humans didn't create utopia like he wanted after the squid attack, he requests that Dr. Manhattan send him to Europa. I felt like this was a twist because up until now, they've sort of been implying that, this is how I felt. I felt like they had been implying that Ozymandias had been imprisoned. I wondered if he had been imprisoned by Dr. Manhattan for his crime against humanity, but now it turns out that he wanted to go to the Garden of Eden and has just grown tired of it, you know, which is very interesting because Dr. Manhattan says, you know, I created a gentler idea of life than on Earth, but essentially, you know, these people that he created, they worshipped him and their whole, you know, lives, everything revolved around him. And he got tired of it. He got bored of it. The beings that he created are almost like dolls. They don't really appear to have the ability to truly think. We actually see in a post-credit scene where they are punishing Ozymandias for wanting to leave, wanting to escape, where they're just like smashing tomatoes in his face. We saw in another scene where they were like having the trial for him trying to escape, where they like released pigs on him and got in his face screaming guilty, 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 and they like bake him this anniversary cake of his time there. Like, they don't behave like real people. They're barely sentient, which is interesting because, well, I feel like it would make sense because Dr. Manhattan created them, and as Ozymandias says, Dr. Manhattan has no imagination because he's not human. He's like moving, quote unquote, past humanity, and so he's like moving past all of the things that make humanity great, except for this ability to feel, which he cannot lose. There are like repeated references to his imagination in this episode, like Ozymandias saying he has no imagination, and Angela saying he has a fantastic imagination, and I feel like the references to his imagination seem to represent the various like versions of Dr. Manhattan, like who he is when he is this sort of perfect god-like figure that has evolved past humanity versus who he is when he is Cal, when he is a human, when he is really in touch with more in touch, because even as Cal, which a lot of you guys noticed and left comments about on my last review, even as Cal, he was still like fairly robotic, I guess you could say, and like really even keeled, but he's still, when he is human, it's like when he's Dr. Manhattan, he has evolved past the mistakes, you could say, of humanity, like war and anger and aggression, wanting to kill each other, but he's also evolved past the wonderful things about being a human as well, which is like imagination and creativity and emotions and love, you know, and so it's sort of like, which would you rather be, you know? All they did was worship him on Europa, which he found boring and unsatisfying, and ultimately it turns out that Adrian is going to find it boring and unsatisfying as well, even though he requested to go there. Again, just more existential musings on free will and what do humans really want? Do we want perfection or do we need conflict? Which again, these are some of the main themes of the original Watchmen canon. And they even use the last line of the original comic in this episode, which is, "Nothing ever ends," which also plays into Dr. Manhattan's sort of circular experiencing of time. Things never begin and they never end, which also, when he's having a conversation with Angela about the last time that he felt fear, when he says he felt fear 50 years ago in the machine, knowing that he's about to be ripped to pieces, and she says to him, well, you put yourself back together and you came back with these amazing powers and now you never have to feel fear again. On the one hand, I can see how, like, for Angela, that would be almost like an ideal, right? Like, that's an ideal for Angela, somebody that's almost living in again, sort of the shadow of constant fear of what happened to her parents and all these things that have happened through her life. You know, this idea of like, wouldn't it be wonderful if I never had to feel fear again because I know everything that's going to happen? And Dr. Manhattan almost like being this physical representation of that shit is not all it's cracked up to be. And the idea of him, you know, experiencing everything all at once also makes me wonder if he's perpetually feeling himself being ripped to pieces at all times and putting himself back together, which again reminded me of Mr. Nobody in Doom Patrol, because he literally was ripped apart in a machine and like put himself back together as well. So, and Doom Patrol is also DC, so these are all DC properties. They introduced the concept of Dr. Manhattan being able to share his abilities during this episode. He conjures an egg for Angela while he's sitting with her in the bar after he introduces himself to her for the first time. She asks him to create life to prove he's Dr. Manhattan, and he conjures up this egg. So after he creates the egg, he also shares to her that he can pass on his abilities, but that he never would do it to someone without their consent, like to a child, like to conceive a child. He also describes that he can put his powers into organic matter, and if someone consumes it, they inherit his powers. So it's like, I could put my powers in this egg, and if you ate it, you'd have my powers. Eggs, these like eggs are like a constant running theme in Watchmen, along with like watches and clocks. And I also feel like clearly this is why 7K is aiming to kidnap him in order to force him to give up his powers, like, which Lady Chu already said. They're going to capture him, they're going to kill him, and then they're going to become him. So even though we're sort of jumping around this episode, time jumping or whatever, we sort of get back to Angela beaming Cal upside his head to remove the device, by the end. The real, I feel like so many air quotes this review, Dr. Manhattan comes out and he still keeps Cal's appearance, only blue and glowing. And in every single one of the sort of flashback scenes where we see that she is originally meeting him, they never show his face. He knows that 7K is outside waiting for him, so he disappears the kids away to be with her grandfather, which I thought, I'm not going to say that this was a weak point in the writing, but like, her kids have never met her grandfather. She just found out that she even had a grandfather. So my first thought was like, those kids were zapped away to some random black dude's house. Like, I guess he can explain everything that's going on, but let's see how that goes. We also find out that her grandfather is living in a house that was left to him by Captain Metropolis. The gay hooded justice plotline remains a weak point in this story to me. I'm sorry. It's just not believable. I think it's lame. I don't like it. I'm going to have more to say about it, I'm sure, at the end. But I was just like, oh, and of course he's living in the house that was formerly belonging to Nelson Gardner. Like, they're really trying to, like, push this narrative that they had some type of, like, true love affair when the writing did not back that up in that episode at all. Since everything sort of happens, like, all at once, relatively speaking, for Dr. Manhattan, it's sort of like he's talking to Angela for the first time in the bar, and at the same time, he's talking to Angela after she sort of woke him up, and at the same time, he's talking to Ozymandias about how he wants Ozymandias to, like, make him mortal, basically, and then at the same time, he's going to see her grandfather, Will Reeves, to ask Will for a favor and to explain everything that's happening and to, like, you know, prepare him for him to, like, send the kids and all this other stuff. And since Angela knows that he's experiencing time all at once, Angela asks him to ask her grandfather about Judd Crawford being in 7K, which is knowledge that she only has now in 2019 because her grandfather, already killed him. So when Dr. Manhattan asks Will Reeves 10 years ago, how did he know that Judd Crawford was in 7K? Her grandfather asks, who's Judd Crawford? Which puts us firmly in a time loop of Angela being the one that made all this happen. And this is why you don't meddle with time. The chicken or the egg paradox. Which came first? You can't be seen when you have a time turner. Angela takes out all of her guns and ammunition to try to save him from 7K, and he tells her, this is the moment that I knew that I loved you. I just told you, you can't save me, and you're going to try anyway, right? And it was just very interesting, because the whole episode, he's been talking about this moment that he knew that he loved her, and then we sort of, like, again, we've caught up to it in real time. It's just a very interesting way to tell a love story, which again reminds me of The Time Traveler's Wife, where in that movie with Eric Bana, I want to say, might not have been him, but I think it was him, and Rachel McAdams, like, he knows he's going to meet his wife and fall in love with her, but he just isn't sure when it will happen because he, like, travels through time, and that leads to him appearing to her at all these random moments in her life, almost like, is now the time? Oh no, this isn't the time, my bad, I'll be back in 10 years. Is now the time? Oh, okay, now's the time, So just a very interesting way of, like, explaining a sequence of events, and especially a love story. I think it's, like, really, really, really interesting. And 7K actually ends up still capturing him using, they have a tachyon laser, which, of course, we have already been introduced to the concept of that being sort of his weakness. It's the same material that the device in his head was made out of. Clearly a kryptonite thing. The special effects from when they take him with the laser are great. Like, round of applause for the special effects in that scene. Round of applause for Regina King fighting in that scene. She's a beast. She's like fucking John Wick. She's taking out everybody. She's jumping in cars. Like, she's fucking kicking everybody's ass. And then Dr. Manhattan just comes and, like, waves a hand and destroys everything. But then he gets sucked into the cannon anyway, which he knows will happen because he already knows this is going to have a tragic ending. So I did enjoy this explanation. I thought the power of love would be cheesy, but I did like seeing this non-linear love story. And I really did enjoy this concept of a tunnel, and jumping through time and the tunnel of love. And, you're there at the beginning and you're there at the end. We spend 10 years in this tunnel and then something tragic happens, but I'm going to make the decision to do it anyway because it's already happened and it's going to continue to happen and like it's never going to stop. Like it's romantic, like it's very romantic. Like I can't front, right? Like this idea of like me and you are going to happen and there's just nothing that either one of us really can do to stop it is like it warmed my little Grinch heart, y'all. My heart grew 2 sizes while watching. I'm not going to lie. So just a few like extra things that I really like that I want to throw out there. They stayed very true to Dr. Manhattan being naked. He's naked in the comics. He's always naked in the originals. Sort of like clothes are something that just doesn't occur to him. This is part of the visual signaling of his move away from humanity. So they definitely have like fucking Cal like walking around naked. But I think it was tastefully done. I'm sure there's going to be some people that didn't care for that. Just because of like, there's always just like weird racial undertones with like Black men walking around naked. There's almost always like a little mandingo something up in there. So I can understand people that thought that were weirded out by it. But I do think it was tastefully done and well done, true to the Watchmen canon. I also like the idea of Dr. Manhattan as this black man because they, in the original Watchmen, like they picked blue for Dr. Manhattan in the first place because they felt like it was close to actual skin tonally, yet it was different from like standard, like typical white skin. And black people do have blue undertones. In Moonlight, black boys look blue, as they say. So I don't know. I like it. I like this decision. I feel like it makes sense. And I think that Black Manta is pretty fucking great as Dr. Manhattan. He's very, very believable to me as Dr. Manhattan, as this sort of like very cool, cold being that also somehow manages to be really charming and like they convinced me. Something else, they had so many blue songs in this episode that I was just like, whose job was it to track these down? Any song that mentioned blue, that had blue in the title, they had it in this episode. I thought that was sort of a really fun wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of cheeky touch. And it also is revealed in this episode that Ozymandias is the one that is perpetually raining squid down on them to this day. Which we have seen both Angela and Wade sort of talk about or witness previously. It appeared to me like he had some type of machine or system set up to automatically generate them every now and then. And in a post-credit scene, the post-credit scene is when we see them like smashing the tomatoes in his face. Like, are you gonna stay, master? Squish, because they're not real people. They're fucking weird dolls, basically. Except for the Game Warden, who I feel like the Game Warden is almost like I don't know if he's supposed to be like an Adam character, like a Lucifer character, you know? Like apparently he was the first being created by Dr. Manhattan, and it seems like the Game Warden is actually sentient to an extent. He wears this mask, he curses, he says fuck, and he brings Ozymandias a cake with a horseshoe baked into it because his servants like bake him these anniversary cakes, I guess to commemorate the time that he has been there on this moon of Jupiter. The Game Warden actually brings him a cake with a horseshoe baked into it, which Ozymandias seems like he sort of begins using it. He gets very excited and starts like digging what appears to be an escape tunnel. So it seems like the Game Warden is a real person, and he's angry. He's angry at Dr. Manhattan because he's like, Dr. Manhattan created me and he created heaven. You know, I saw him, you know, create this Eden, create this paradise, but we weren't enough for him. You know, he abandoned us. That was giving me satanic Lucifer vibes, or, you know, I don't know. There seemed like there was something there, again, in terms of like existential crisis, and he ended up giving Ozymandias a cake with the horseshoe baked into it so that he could escape. So I'm very interested on seeing where that goes. I hope that it will be revealed at some point if the Game Warden is someone. There's also some loose ends that I hope get wrapped up in this last episode, episode 9. I feel like the writers actually bit off more than they could chew. Maybe this is the bad, but technically it doesn't have anything to do with episode 8 thus far. But I feel like the writers bit off more than they could chew in terms of the subplots outside of Angela. Again, everything that directly involved Angela has been extremely tight and well written for me, to the point where some of the other subplots come across like afterthoughts. The fucking lube dude that she saw when she was like dismantling her grandfather's wheelchair, I feel like that has never been explained. It's been like 2 or 3 episodes and it still hasn't been explained like what exactly happened to Wade. I'm sure he's going to come back in episode 9. We saw her adopted kid's like real grandfather at some point when he like showed up on her porch and she like paid him to leave. he never came back. There's a lot of things that got introduced to us earlier in the season that we have not followed up on. And so now I just hope that the finale doesn't feel rushed or, jam-packed with things that have to be reintroduced to us just to be wrapped up, because now it's the last episode, right? So we'll see. We'll see. Last review before the end. We're already almost to the end of Watchmen. So Watchmen episode 8 review. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Food for thought as always. See you guys next time.